that could present its own problems, but it's one way to ensure that seriousness. And the last thing to note about that, one of the critiques people make, which I think is illegitimate or unfounded, but is very common, is that we should not give respect to secessionist desires, whether in referenda or in polls, because they're ephemeral. So you mentioned these polls in California. Some of this is like from, if it's in late 2017, this is like an anti-Trump reaction, right? Do people really mean it, is the question. Well, my argument is people are always ephemeral, right? Their politics are changing constantly. And I don't know why we would necessarily refuse to respect their desire for exit just because it might not last if we reject it. It's one of the key insights. If we were to validate it in the moment and make that state a separate state, then we'd be living in a different future in which those people would be in their own state and that ephemeral thing would become entrenched. There's real data about this. I remember there was once at a conference where someone was talking about the fact that Eastern Ukraine in the 1990s, polls were taken that showed very high levels of desire to separate from Ukraine and join Russia in the eastern provinces. Right. Then those numbers went down again. And the point at the conference initially was, you see, it was an ephemeral sense. But this misses the sort of essential analytical context that the reason it went down may be because their desires were unrealized and at the time unrealizable. But had they separated and you took another poll, what might you find? Well, what we know is in every place where the secession has happened, you see an entrenchment. So sentiment to break up parts of Yugoslavia, like Slovenia, it's not certain. It can be ephemeral, but later you don't find people wishing it back, right? You get entrenched majorities of Slovakia, entrenched majorities for the way things now are. And this is, I think, a key error in discounting those desires as somehow ephemeral or transitory. That's an incredibly arrogant position because it implies that you know the future. And so we're going to shut down that choice. And then, yes, people accommodate themselves to the world they live in which they're told you can't exit. Well, if you're like a Kosovo Albanian in 1960 inside Yugoslavia, what is it you desire? And what are you going to say you desire? I think these might be two very different things. So I think we should credit people's transitory, ephemeral, political desires, because that's what their political desires often are. And if they center around the idea of a new state, we should give that as much credit as we do their transitory, ephemeral desire to continue with the state they're currently in. Both of these things are political desires of the moment that can shift.
I love that. Okay, my last main question, and we can cover anything else you would like, but you don't have to answer this question. I ask every professor. You can say, hey, I'm going to pass. That's fine. It's a somewhat controversial question, but that's why I keep asking it, because I think it's important. And I don't see people discussing this anywhere. And for me, it's huge. It's blatantly obvious. So I'd like to present a scenario to you, Professor. Government A has a secession movement. They send in SWAT teams, punch people protesting, crack heads open, confiscate ballot boxes, point guns at people, threaten to arrest leaders for even having this vote. The group's totally peaceful, but they said, you don't get to have a vote, and if you do, well, we're going to crack heads open and arrest people and threaten to shoot people. Government B has the same secession movement, and they too respond with SWAT teams and confiscating votes and pointing guns at people and cracking heads open. Now, government A is called China, talking about Hong Kong. Government B is called Spain and Catalonia. What is the difference between this dictatorial government's harsh response to a vote for independence and a Western European country's response to Catalonian independence, sending in SWAT teams, cracking heads open, arresting leaders, threatening to imprison them? Why does the West almost say nothing of condemning Spain, but goes out of its way to condemn China when those two things look too damn close? Am I missing something here?
I can't imagine why people wouldn't want to answer that question. Well, I don't know that I agree with the
Am I wrong?
I don't know that I agree with the premise because I think many actors criticized Spain. It's true it did not the actions in Spain did not produce an, a rejection of the European and global consensus that we don't support secession movements elsewhere, but it definitely cracked that consensus to some degree. There was a great deal of criticism, even by some European leaders, and we also know that there were actions by judges and others who offered, in a sense, juridical protection to Catalan officials who'd left, refusing to extradite them back and so forth, in ways that, although they're mostly a question of legal process, I think could also be understood as a kind of rebuke of Spain's behavior. So I'm not sure I fully agree that Spain got a complete pass on that. It does speak to the solidity of that consensus. I agree. I'd also question the premise in the sense that I think it's conflating their behavior too much. It's true those things happened in Spain, and again, were much criticized. The Catalan movement received a great deal more support precisely because that level of response was seen as so shocking in the European context. I think it's fair to say, however, that the analogy could be, well, all analogies break down at some point, and the behavior of the Chinese state to its own population, including its own minorities, its autonomous regions, is orders of magnitude more severe than the overreactions in Spain, which I think were mistaken with wrong-headed and well-deserving criticism in the way I think you're implying. But I myself would draw a distinction between that and what's happened in China. If I step back, perhaps the level at which I could accept the premise and not disagree is, look, both these countries are making politically ill-advised, well, they may be politically wise, but they're morally ill-advised, questionable responses to legitimate movements, whether it be Hong Kong or Catalonia. The better answer is to engage with these communities, allow them to make political choices, and persuade them of the value of staying in their shared union. So at that highly general level, I think Spain and China have both adopted similar models. But that's partly because that's what most countries in the world do. Most countries fundamentally share the underlying norm of territorial integrity and the right of the state to resist its division by its own people. China is more extreme than some in actually criminalizing peaceful advocacy of this goal, which Spain does not do. Even though it reacted in the way you say, I think it's safe to say that's a different kind of response that was understood as a police response to the misuse of public authority. But I think it would not be quite the same, although it's true that I accept that you can read some of the Spanish actions as quasi criminalizing acts of secession, but not purely peaceable ones, advocacy and whatnot. I think they're quite different. But my point is that most states, in fact, accept the idea that the state has a legitimate right to limit this process, including this one, of course. And you could think of the same there, right? We don't accept the right of secession. Logically, that means at some point the state has the right to use public order powers to limit actions in that direction. Not that we would do anything like you're describing, but one has to think about what is the logic of saying that you're not allowed to secede. I think that's what happened in Spain, but I do question the